So my presentation is going to be about the economic value of emergency groundwater pumping in the Yakima Basin in Washington State, and it's great that I get to go after Sasha because he touched a little bit on the emergency wells pumping, so you have a little bit of background on what's going on. So for my presentation, I'd like to first start by giving you a brief overview of why this is actually important and what's actually going on with this, and then after that I'd like to talk about some of the mitigation options that the farmers or the irrigation districts in the region have during drought, and specifically within those mitigation options I would like to focus on the role of the emergency wells and how that's playing out in the basin. And after that I'll touch on some of the research methods that we're using to implement our ideas. And I'll also touch on some of the preliminary results. I mean, this is very much a work in progress, so I don't have the complete results, but I'll show you what I have. And then finally, I would like to talk about some of the limitations of this research and how we can take it further in the future. So first, starting with the overview, as many of you in the room may know, Washington State is one of the major agricultural states in the United States, with an agriculture industry of about $49 billion, and the agriculture industry contributes about 15% to the state's whole economy. So agriculture is a pretty big deal in Washington, as you might know. And then just zooming in on the agriculture in Washington, as my speaker before me mentioned, Washington is the largest producer of apples, sweet cherries, grapes, pears, and hops, like the largest state producer. And this is a really cool map here, cool figure, where it breaks down the agricultural industry by counties. It shows exactly how big the agriculture sector in each county in Washington State is, with some highlights. So that's pretty cool. And then, so the zooming in, Washington State, just focusing on the Yakima River Basin. This is where it's located in the south central region of the state, and then in the Yakima Basin we have two major irrigation districts, the Rosa Irrigation District and the Wapato Irrigation Districts, and we also have other numerous minor irrigation districts throughout the region. And then some of the numbers in this graph might be a little out of date because I think this figure is from 2011. So the reservoir stories and the water entitlements numbers might be a little bit different, but I just wanted to show you geographically which area I'm talking about. So moving on with the overview. So as you know, there was a big drought in 2015, just last year in Washington State, and then according to a state study, it was estimated that the effect on the agriculture industry was about $1.2 billion, including all the direct and the indirect effects. So yeah, it was pretty severe. And in the Yakima Basin, 60% of the water that is needed for a regular harvest in a normal year, in a non-drought year, comes from the snowpack. So basically, all the snow we get in the winter just melts and flows into the streams and all the river systems, and that's how the water in the reservoirs get replenished during the summer when it gets really dry. And then, so why this is important is because the snowpack that contributes so much to the water supply in the region is expected to diminish in the next 10 years. And so here's a map where it shows the snow water equivalents for the last 3 years, for 2013, 14, and 15. So basically, snow water equivalence is just the amount of water that you would get if you melted all the snowpack that you get in a year. So they measure that throughout various regions in the state in May every year, and then so the way they calculate the snow water equivalence, these numbers, the percentages that you are seeing on screen, is that from 1981 to 2010, every May of all of those years, they calculate the snowpack and then they take an average, and then that average basically is our reference point. That's the 100% supply. So if it says 115%, then that's basically means that it was 115% of that annual average for those 30 years. So as you can see, in 2015, it got really bad, especially in the Yakima Basin. If you can see there on screen, on the upper Yakima region, the snowpack got way down to as low as 3%. So it was really severe. There's very little snowpack last year. And because like it is forecasted that this will only get more frequent in the future, then there's bound to be serious like water curtailments for the irrigation districts and the farmers in the basin. And because there will be water curtailments, it will have significant economic impact on the agriculture industry as well. And so like because of the situation, like so what can the irrigation districts actually do? Like what are their options to mitigate these effects of drought, right? So that's the next thing that I want to get into. So there are many options. The first one is holding ponds, which is very simple idea where you just take surface water, you like dig a pond and store it there, and then you just use it during dry season when you need it. So that's basically the idea of holding ponds. The next thing is water banking. Like holding ponds, you could say, is a type of water banking, but water banking, I guess, is more broadly defined. You don't need to actually physically store the water to be a water bank. You can just bank the right to use the water. So if you want to sell your right to use water to someone else downstream, then you can just not use that water and someone downstream will use it. So that also qualifies as water banking. So that's why I have those separated. The other thing is water markets, and there was a really cool talk by Professor Nick Proksovitz from Nebraska like yesterday, where he's developing a smart market where he's basically creating an online algorithm to match the buyers and sellers who are interested in like leasing or buying or selling of water rights, because often in many states in the United States, the water laws can be very different in different states, so it's very difficult often for buyers and sellers to actually come together and to do the trading that they want to do. So this is like a new development, the water markets, which is really helpful. And then so the last thing, like, and the focus of my study is on the emergency groundwater or emergency wells, and that's what I would like to get into next. So emergency wells, basically, you know, like you can't just use emergency wells like whenever you want. Like in Washington, the groundwater regulation is a bit more sophisticated. I guess in California, like the groundwater regulation, from my understanding, is like next to non-existent. But in Washington, we do have some regulations. So like to be able to use these emergency wells, it needs to be a state-recognized drought, and like the Department of Ecology is the one who declares like a state drought emergency. And then so even after like you have a state recognized drought, you can't use emergency wells just because it's a state recognized drought. So like the Department of Ecology actually like reviews your application, and then they look at like is like drilling a well in certain areas going to have certain effects on other water users. Is it feasible? Is it gonna have an effect on the underground water storage and stuff like that? So there's a whole process that you have to go through to be able to be eligible to use these emergency wells. And so like, but when it's applicable, like these emergency wells could be very helpful in reducing the economic impacts to the extent that they reduce the economic losses for the farmers. And then so the interesting thing is that a lot of studies have looked at like what is the total economic impact of drought in the Yakima Basin, but now the studies have actually evaluated like the economic value of just groundwater pumping, like how much can it mitigate the effects of drought in the region. So that's basically the objective of this study, is to start looking at like or figuring out the economic value of the use of these groundwater pumping. So here I have a graph. I'm not sure how many of you have a background in economics in the audience, but this is pretty simple anyway. So so basically what I have here is on the y-axis is the price of water. On the x-axis I have the quantity of water. The curve is the water demand, and the vertical lines are basically the water supply. So the very last line at the end would be the regular water supply in a normal year when there's no drought, right? So that's water supply without curtailment. But like so the idea is basically that, you know, like if there's a drought, then change A happens. So you move from the third line to the first line, where you get to a new supply curve, which is basically your water supply after the curtailment, right? And then so, but if you're like allowed to use the emergency wells during a drought, then change B happens, where the supply curve again moves in the opposite direction, and you have an increased supply And then, so basically what we're trying to figure out is that is area C in that figure right there, where the area enclosed within the demand curve and the two supply curves basically gives you the economic value of groundwater pumping in the region. So that's the idea. And so to do this, like for our research method, what we're doing is we're looking at 5 different things. The first thing we're looking at is a hydrological model for the basin that's based on RiverWare. RiverWare is basically a model developed by the researchers in University of Colorado, where you can input your river systems, your reservoirs, and all this, like like the water distribution into the system, along with like environmental constraints, regulations from the state and things like that, and then it sort of gives you a distribution of water throughout the basin, like how is the water actually distributed. And I'll get into why we're actually looking at these things in a little bit. The second thing we look at is the agricultural crop distribution, so what kind of crops are being grown in the region. And that's important because, like, depending on like what types of crops are grown, the value of water may be different, because if you're using like certain amount of water for a certain amount of crops, and like depending on if it's a high value crop or a low value crop, that tells you like what the actual value of water that's being used is. So that's the second thing. The other thing is we're looking at the emergency well log data that we have for 2001 and 2005. As Sasha earlier mentioned, we don't have the complete data from 2015, so that's right now not in this study, but we're planning on using that as well whenever it's available. And then the fourth thing is the curtailment history. So we had drought in 2001, 2005, and in 2015. So like how much was the water supply actually reduced, or like how much curtailment was there. So we look at that data set, and also based on like the CIMP3 climate model, like we look at like projecting like the curtailment rates in the future, like so basically we're projecting like how much curtailment there may be in the future. So we're looking at that. So the whole point of looking at these 5 things is that the first 2 things, the agricultural crop distribution and the hydrological model, basically will be used to trace out the water demand curve to see like where exactly that the demand curve is. And using 3, 4, and 5, which is our the log data, the emergency wells log data, and the curtailment rate, and the curtailment rate projections, we figure out where the water supply curve, those 3 like vertical lines that I showed you earlier were. And then after we do that, then we basically calculate the area C that I showed you earlier in the graph. So that's like the idea. So just getting into some of the preliminary results. So the curtailment rate in the Yakima Basin in 2001 was 67%, 61% in 2005. And in 2001, given like 67% of curtailment rate, there was like 34,437 acre feet of emergency well water that was pumped out of the ground. And this is a rough estimate, and I say it's a rough estimate because the Department of Ecology, they are working on building a new tracking system that has all this information. This data set, I believe, was collected just by looking through different paper documents and stuff like that. So they may not line up exactly. And then for 2015, we're still waiting on the data set, but we expect that in 2005, the pumping estimates would be lower because of the lower curtailment rate, and in 2015 we expect it to be higher because the snowpack was really low, and the curtailment rate was also very close to the 2001 curtailment rate. And so finally, talking about the limitations, like I didn't really touch on like the surface groundwater interaction that may happen, because if you pump water out of a well, then that might have some effect on the surface water flow. I mean, some of this is already done by the Department of Ecology, because when you apply for an emergency well permit, then they actually go to the location and then they actually see if there is certain surface groundwater interaction, and then they approve it only after they think that there's no severe interaction. So some of this is already accounted for, but we are actually planning on using a integrated groundwater model for that specific basin, so that we can like specifically trace out these indirect effects from the surface water groundwater interaction. For now, like we don't have that in the study, but that's where we're planning to go next. And that's my presentation. Any questions?
Thank you. Interesting. How many, quick questions for you. How many emergency wells are there, and how do they, you don't know when the drought's going to end.
Right.
So how far do you have to project forward in terms of what the impacts of the turning on those wells are?
Right. So the actual number of wells, like I'm not sure how many there are, but like basically, like if you want to like drill a new well, then you just have to apply to the Department of Ecology, and then they come look at the location, and then they tell you if you can actually do it or not. And then so for like the projections, we're just looking at the next 10 years for now for this paper. That's what we're looking at, because we have like the climate change scenarios based on our climate change models. Like we only have like the projections for the next 10 years, so that's what we're looking at right now.
Other questions? Maybe you mentioned it, but is the Yakima Basin in overdraft?
Sorry, say that again?
Is the Yakima Basin in overdraft?
Groundwater
overdraft.
The groundwater, oh, okay, yeah, so yeah, I think that's occurring in certain regions because they built the wells too close to each other, and then, you know, like because of that, I think the hydrologic causes a depression or some term that I forget, but basically if you have two wells close to each other, then the aquifer underneath just kind of sinks in and you don't get water, so that's occurring in various regions. That's why like the Department of Ecology they have started actually being very strict on like the locations that's where you can build these emergency wells.
And maybe you covered this too, but who pays for the emergency wells, and what happens to them after the emergency?
Right, so that's a good question. So for the 2015 drought, there was a 50-50 agreement between the Department of Ecology and the users, and then the cost includes the drilling of the wells, the assessment of the location, and all the scientific research to actually see if it's feasible or not. So the 50% of all the total cost is covered by Ecology, and 50% is paid by the user if they want to do that. That's for 2015, right? So.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
So Graham's question just brought this to mind. So if these makes sense. If these are emergency wells, they're going to be used for a period, and then they're going to go into some fairly long period of dormancy, possibly, and waiting for the next period when they're needed again.
Right.
The way they're constructed should be considered very carefully. If they have long well screens and if they have even longer gravel packs,
right.
They have the very real potential to act as conduits for vertical contaminant migration and redistribution when they're off. And if it's an agricultural area, you tend to have nitrates, TDS, maybe some other things at higher concentration, shallower in the system. So sort of think about unintended consequences, maybe.
Sure, that's a very good point. And I think like I don't think it happened in 2001 or 2005, but because the last year's drought was really severe. Like I think, like I mentioned, like the Department of Ecology is actually taking the initiative on doing like most of these things, like assessing the water quality, figuring out if it's like okay to drill a well and then not degrade the quality of water that's being pumped out and all these consequences. So some of that is covered there, but for my study here, like for now, like this is in very like preliminary stage, but definitely in the future we'd like to include like all the water quality issues and the effects it may have, like the unintended consequences as well. So yeah.